Two identical faces stared back at the booking officer through the reinforced glass of the Kemung County Jail intake window. Same hollow eyes, same angular jawline, same cold indifference to the gravity of what they'd done. For the first time in their lives, Robert and Steven Spahulski were together behind bars, one awaiting trial for murder, the other serving time for theft. But this wasn't their first dance with violence, and it wouldn't be their last. By the time the final body count was tallied decades later, 5 people would be dead at the hands of these twins, and 5 families would be shattered. This is the story about the serial killer duo called the Spahulski twins. Elmira, New York, in the 1960s, was the kind of place where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on and neighbors knew each other's names. The Spahulski household, nestled on a tree-lined street, looked no different from any other working-class family trying to make it in small-town America. Robert and Steven were born minutes apart, but those minutes might as well have been years for how differently the world would remember them. As toddlers, they developed their own secret language, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate without words. Their mother would later describe watching them play in the backyard, moving in perfect synchronization, as if they were 2 halves of the same person. The first crack in their foundation came when they were 12. Their parents' marriage collapsed in a storm of arguments and slammed doors, leaving the boys to be raised by their mother alone. While other children might have leaned on friends or teachers during such upheaval, the Spahulski twins turned inward, their bond becoming less like brotherhood and more like a fortress built for 2. Neighbors remembered them as quiet boys who kept to themselves, but there were whispers. Pets went missing. Small fires appeared in empty lots. And sometimes, when one twin got in trouble, the other would appear with an alibi so perfectly timed it seemed rehearsed. The seeds of something dark were already taking root, nourished by a shared sense of abandonment and a growing realization that rules were meant for other people. In the late 1960s, Robert Spahulski would commit his first crime. At 16, Robert spotted an unlocked car idling outside a convenience store. He slipped behind the wheel and drove off, not for any destination in particular, but simply because he could. When the police caught him, Robert didn't seem ashamed or sorry. He seemed almost relieved to finally be noticed. But it was what happened next that revealed the true nature of what was growing inside him. Just weeks after his arrest, Robert entered his high school after hours and set fire to an empty classroom. He watched the flames consume desks and blackboards before slipping away into the night. The judge gave him 15 weekends in jail, a punishment that might have deterred a normal teenager, but Robert wasn't normal. During those weekend stays, he met career criminals who taught him that getting caught wasn't a failure, it was simply the cost of doing business. The system had given him a slap on the wrist for destruction that could have killed dozens. The lesson he learned wasn't about consequences, it was about calculation. Steven watched his brother's transformation with a mixture of admiration and envy. Their telepathic connection, once used for childhood games, now carried darker signals. If Robert could cross that line and survive, what was stopping him from crossing his own? While the Spahulski twins were perfecting their descent into criminality, the small community of Elmira was trying to make sense of a new kind of violence. Detective Frank Morrison had worked the same beat for 15 years, dealing mostly with domestic disputes and the occasional bar fight. He thought he'd seen everything small-town crime had to offer. Then came the night of November 24th, 1971. Ronald Ripley was supposed to close the Salad Master kitchen store at 9 p.m. that night. Instead, he was found the next morning, beaten with a hammer and stabbed multiple times. Ripley had been attacked from behind while working alone in the store that night. Morrison had investigated dozens of robberies, but this felt different. Nothing was stolen. The cash register remained untouched. Whoever killed Ripley hadn't come for money, they'd come for something else entirely. The brutality suggested rage, but the cleanup showed calculation. The killer had taken time to wash the blood from his hands before disappearing into the night. As Morrison canvassed the neighborhood, he kept hearing the same names whispered by residents. The Spaholski twins. They were known troublemakers, but murder? It seemed like too much of a leap. Detective Morrison had dealt with Stephen before, from petty theft to disturbing the peace, but the boy had always seemed more lost than dangerous. What Morrison didn't understand yet was that he wasn't just hunting one killer. He was witnessing the birth of two. The interrogation room at the Chemung County Police Station had hosted countless confessions, but nothing prepared Detective Morrison for what happened when Stephen Spaholski walked in that winter morning in 1971. The young man sat down across from Morrison, folded his hands on the metal table, and said 7 words that would haunt the detective for the rest of his career. "I killed Ronald Ripley. He deserved it." He claimed Ripley had made sexual advances, leaving him no choice but to defend himself, but the details didn't match the crime scene. The level of violence, the multiple stab wounds, the deliberate positioning of the body, this wasn't self-defense. This was execution. As Stephen was processed into the county jail, a cruel twist of fate placed him in the same facility where his twin brother Robert was serving time for parole violations. The brothers, separated by concrete and steel, found ways to communicate through other inmates. Prison guards would later report seeing them during yard time, standing on opposite sides of the exercise area, never speaking but somehow coordinating their movements like dancers following the same silent music. What the authorities didn't realize was that this wasn't a coincidence. It was a competition, their entire lives trying to outdo each other, from childhood games to teenage rebellion. Now, with one brother officially branded a killer, the stakes had escalated beyond anything their small town had ever seen. Robert's transformation accelerated. His petty crimes became more audacious, his sentences longer. But it wasn't enough. Stephen had crossed the ultimate line, and Robert's jealousy burned like acid in his veins. He began planning something that would dwarf his brother's single act of violence, something that would prove once and for all which twin was truly the monster. Rochester, New York, in the 1990s, was a city in decline, its streets offering perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to move through shadows. Robert Spaholski had learned to blend into this urban decay, his addiction to crack cocaine providing both motivation and camouflage for the darkness that had been growing inside him for decades. His methodology was as calculated as it was brutal. He targeted society's most vulnerable sex workers, addicts, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive manhunts. Maureen Armstrong was found in her apartment on New Year's Eve in 1990, electrical cords wrapped around her neck. The scene was staged to look like rough sex gone wrong, but the ligature marks told a different story. This was slow, deliberate strangulation by someone who enjoyed watching life leave another person's eyes. 7 months later, Adrienne Berger's decomposing body was discovered in her Rochester apartment. The summer heat had accelerated decay, and flies buzzed around windows that hadn't been opened in days. The stench was so overwhelming that first responders had to take breaks outside just to breathe. But it was the positioning of the body that told investigators they were dealing with someone who viewed murder not as a crime of passion, but as performance art. Robert's masterpiece came with Charles Grand, a landscaper who made the fatal mistake of stiffing his killer on a drug deal. Robert bludgeoned Grande to death with the same weapon his twin brother had used on Ronald Ripley 20 years earlier. The parallel wasn't lost on investigators. Even separated by distance and decades, the Spaholski twins were still mirroring each other's violence, still competing for the title of most depraved. But Robert's greatest act of audacity came after the murder. He took Grande's identity, driving the dead man's car and using his name when stopped by police. For 2 days, Robert Spaholski walked the streets as a ghost, a living man wearing the identity of his victim like a trophy. The Rochester Police Station's front desk had seen countless criminals walk through its doors, but few had ever arrived like Robert Spaholski did on that spring morning in 2005. He didn't stumble in drunk or get dragged in by arresting officers. He walked in calmly, approached the desk sergeant, and said, "I need to confess to a murder." What followed was 12 hours of the most chilling testimony Detective Morrison had heard in 30 years of law enforcement. Robert didn't just confess to killing Vivian. He provided a guided tour to 4 separate murders, each described with the clinical precision of a surgeon and the emotional detachment of a man discussing the weather. "I choked her out," he said, describing Maureen Armstrong's death. "She wanted money for sex after we shared cocaine." His voice never wavered, his hands never shook. He sipped water from a plastic cup between confessions as if he were taking a break from any ordinary conversation. But it was what Robert said about his final victim that revealed the true depth of his psychological break from reality. He claimed he saw Vivian transform into a demon, that killing her was an act of necessity rather than choice. After strangling her, he washed her body with the tenderness of a caretaker before dumping it in the basement. Later, he would return to apologize to her corpse, carrying on conversations with the woman he had murdered. The parallel to his twin brother's behavior was unmistakable. Stephen had also reported talking to Ronald Ripley after stabbing him to death, as if the act of murder created some twisted form of intimacy between killer and victim. Even in their confessions, the Spahulski twins were mirror images of each other, 2 broken minds operating on the same wavelength of destruction. When the guilty verdict was read, Robert showed the same emotional flatness that had characterized his entire killing spree. He cast a fleeting glance at the jury foreman, sipped his water, and accepted his fate with the resignation of a man who had always known this day would come. Robert Spahulski was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never again walk free. He currently resides at Great Meadows Correctional Facility, where he maintains the same cold demeanor that characterized his killing spree. Prison psychologists have tried for years to understand what drives him, but Robert offers only clinical descriptions of his crimes, as if discussing weather patterns rather than human lives destroyed. Stephen was released in 2009 after serving over 3 decades for Ronald Ripley's murder. His freedom lasted 6 months. He walked into a bank in El Morath, same town where their criminal careers began, and robbed it at gunpoint. When arrested, he told police he was surprised to learn his twin had become a serial killer. "I thought I was the family's only murderer," he said, a statement that revealed the competitive nature of their relationship even extended to their final acts of violence. Detective Morrison, now retired, still visits the graves of Robert's victims every year. He carries with him a question that has haunted him since that first confession in 1971. Were the Spahulski twins born evil? Or did their shared trauma create a feedback loop of violence that amplified their worst impulses? The twins spent most of their adult lives in the same prison facilities, their parallel paths through the criminal justice system as synchronized as their childhood games. Some reports suggest they maintained a deadly competition, each trying to outdo the other's crimes. But there's no way to know for certain whether their violence was nature, nurture, or something far more sinister, proof that sometimes evil finds a way to replicate itself. In the end, we are left with an unsolvable equation. 2 identical men, shaped by identical circumstances, who chose identical paths of destruction. Their story forces us to confront the darkest possibility about human nature, that some people aren't broken by trauma, but are simply waiting for permission to become the monsters they were always meant to be,